Before the book became something ordinary on a shelf, in a backpack, on a bedside table, or in a child's hands, it was something far more fragile, a way for human memory to survive. Long before printing presses, before paperbacks, before libraries and bookstores and digital screens, people were already fighting the same quiet battle against time. They wanted words to last. They wanted stories, laws, prayers, poems, names, and ideas to remain after the voice had faded. And somehow, from clay, papyrus, parchment, ink, thread, and paper, the book became one of the most powerful inventions in human history. Because the history of the book is not only the story of pages, it is the story of how human beings learned to make memory outlive the moment. Before the book had pages, it had weight. Not emotional weight, though it would eventually have that too. Physical weight. The earliest forms of recorded writing did not look like the books we know today. Human beings first preserved words and records on materials like clay tablets, stone, and later papyrus rolls. In those early stages, writing was not yet something most people carried around for private reflection. It was often tied to accounting, religion, administration, trade, law, and power. To write something down was to make it authoritative. To preserve it was to give it permanence. Even then, long before the modern book existed, people already understood something profound. Memory is fragile, but writing can resist forgetting. That was the first transformation. Words stopped belonging only to the mouth. They began belonging to time. And that change is almost impossible to overstate. Once speech could become inscription, human experience no longer had to disappear so quickly. A ruler's command could travel beyond the room where it was spoken. A prayer could survive the person who whispered it. A contract could outlast trust. A story could move across generations without depending entirely on memory. Writing did not eliminate forgetting, but it changed the balance between memory and loss. It gave human beings a new way to push back against silence. But the story of the book was still only beginning. For a long time, one of the most important ancestors of the book was the scroll. Papyrus rolls, especially in the ancient Mediterranean world, became major vehicles for literary and administrative writing. They carried text in a long, continuous form, meant to be unrolled and read in sequence. And yet the scroll had limits. It was harder to navigate, harder to store efficiently, and less practical for quickly finding a specific passage. At some point, human beings were not only asking how to preserve words, they were asking how to arrange them better, and that question changed everything. The codex, the ancestor of the modern book, emerged as one of the great turning points in the history of written culture. Britannica describes the codex as the earliest type of manuscript in the form of a modern book, with pages stitched together along one side, replacing earlier rolls of papyrus and wax tablets because it offered several advantages over the scroll. Those advantages mattered. A codex could be opened to a page. It could be written on both sides. It was easier to handle, easier to organize, easier to preserve in some contexts, and better suited to sustained reading and reference. In other words, the book did not become powerful only because humans had things to say. It became powerful because they found a form capable of holding those things more intelligently. And maybe that is the first emotional twist in the story. The book was not just invented to hold words. It was invented to hold them in a way a human life could actually use. In the early Christian era, codices became especially associated with Christian writings, while many pagan works still circulated as rolls. Britannica notes that in surviving books from the first 4 centuries AD, codices more often contained Christian writings, while pagan works were usually on rolls. Over time, the codex gained ground. The page began to win against the scroll. What had once been a practical alternative slowly became the dominant shape of the book. And once that happened, reading itself began to change. A book was no longer simply a long strip of text. It became an object you could return to, annotate, compare, carry, and live with. Then came the medieval book, and with it another transformation. Before the age of printing, books were copied by hand. Britannica describes the medieval book as a codex written on vellum or parchment, with many later manuscripts on paper by the 15th century. Monasteries, scriptoria, and skilled scribes preserved religious texts, classical knowledge, legal works, poetry, and illuminated manuscripts of astonishing beauty. But books in this age were precious not only because they were beautiful, they were precious because they were slow. Every copied page represented labor, attention, and time. A book could take months or years to create. That meant books were rare, expensive, and often inaccessible to ordinary people. Knowledge existed, but it moved slowly. Memory survived, but at great cost. And that is where the deeper pain of early book history appears. People had learned how to preserve thought, but not yet how to spread it widely. This is why the invention of printing changed so much more than production. It changed the social life of knowledge itself. Britannica notes that before the invention of printing, the number of manuscript books in Europe could be counted in thousands, but by 1500, after only about 50 years of printing, there were more than 9 million books. That number is astonishing. It means the book stopped being a rare treasure for the few and began becoming a force that could reach the many. Printing did not only make books faster, it changed the scale of literacy, religion, science, politics, education, and debate. The book was no longer moving at the speed of the scribe. It was now moving at the speed of a civilization accelerating. That was the book's great revolution. It became reproducible. And once something becomes reproducible, power shifts. A printed book can challenge a church, inspire a reformer, educate a child, provoke a revolution, preserve a language, or carry an idea farther than its author ever travels. That is why the history of the book is never only literary, it is political, religious, scientific, emotional. A book can hold a private diary or a public manifesto, a sacred text or a dangerous theory, a lullaby or a law. What changed with print was not merely the object itself, but the possibility that many people could enter the same conversation across distance and time. One mind could now reach thousands, then millions. And history would never really slow down again. But the book kept changing. Materials changed, formats changed, audiences changed, paper became more common, printing technologies improved, literacy spread unevenly but steadily in many societies. Books expanded beyond elites and institutions into homes, schools, markets, and ordinary routines. The book became a companion, a textbook, a novel, a manual, a gift, a childhood memory, a refuge, a weapon, a comfort. It could sit in a library as preserved wisdom or travel in a pocket as a personal secret. The book did something very few inventions managed to do. It became both civilizational and intimate at the same time. And maybe that is why people love books so deeply. Because a book is public thought made private. Many technologies connect us to crowds. A book often does the opposite. It connects one mind to another in silence. You open it alone, and yet you are no longer alone. A person long dead can speak inside your afternoon. A stranger from another century can rearrange your inner life. A child can discover that their feelings are not unique. A grieving person can find language for sorrow. A curious person can step into a world they have never seen. The book may be one of the quietest inventions ever made, but emotionally, it is one of the loudest. Then came the modern world, and with it another strange shift. The book became ordinary, and that may be its greatest triumph. To become ordinary is not to become unimportant. It is to become woven into life so thoroughly that people forget how miraculous it once was. Shelves full of books, cheap paperbacks, school books passed from hand to hand, libraries open to the public, bookstores in stations and airports, manuals, cookbooks, dictionaries, novels, picture books, prayer books, textbooks, journals. The book moved from monastery and palace into bus stops, classrooms, kitchens, and nightstands. It stopped being a luxury object for many and became part of the architecture of everyday thought. But of course, the story did not end there. In the digital age, people began asking whether the book would disappear. Screens changed reading habits. Text became searchable, portable, instant, and infinitely duplicable again in new ways. Yet the book, as a form, did not vanish. It adapted. Printed books remained. E-books arrived. Audiobooks expanded the idea of what reading might feel like. What survived through all these changes was not just paper and binding, but the deeper human need the book had always served. The need to preserve thought, share memory, and enter another mind across time. The technology evolved, but the longing remained. And that may be the final lesson. The history of the book is not really about ink, glue, thread, or paper. It is about endurance. It is about the refusal to let memory die too quickly. It is about humanity deciding that some thoughts deserve a longer life than the breath that first carried them. From clay tablets to papyrus rolls, from codices to illuminated manuscripts, from printing presses to paperbacks to digital text, the form kept changing because the need never did. Human beings wanted to remember better, to teach farther, to feel less alone, to leave something behind that could still speak after they were gone. So when you hold a book now, do not see only pages. See the clay tablet, the scroll, the codex, the scribe, the press, the shelf, the child learning to read, the student underlining a line, the traveler carrying one worn copy, the old book filled with another person's notes, the quiet room where someone turned a page and felt their life shift just a little. See the long human struggle against forgetting. See the invention that taught memory how to survive. Because the history of the book is, in the end, not just the history of an object. It is the story of how human beings learn to let their minds outlive their bodies. And maybe that is why books still move us. Not because they are old, but because they are one of the most beautiful ways humanity ever found to remain present after disappearing. If you stayed until the end, then maybe a book no longer feels like just paper and ink to you. Maybe it feels more like memory, survival, comfort, or one of the quiet ways human beings learn to speak across centuries. So I'd love to hear from you. When you think about books, what do they mean to you most? Knowledge, escape, memory, healing, or something deeper? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if this story stayed with you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the bell for more storytelling videos about the ordinary objects and quiet inventions that changed human history.